Two brand new orchids in today's video, very different from each other, coming up at the Orchid Hut. Welcome back to the Orchid Hut. My name is Dana, and one of these new orchids in my collection is so large that you can probably barely see me standing behind it. Now, I've added these two orchids to my collection about maybe 3 weeks ago during the height of the summer heat, and they have just sort of been acclimating to my environment during that time, and I have finally gotten around to making a video and sharing them with you. Now, they are very, very different from each other. One of them is a species, and the other one is a complex intergeneric hybrid. So let's have a look at the names, and what I will be doing is putting a timestamp because I will be talking about this large orchid first, and then I will be talking about the smaller one second. So if you would like to skip to that part of the video, you can do so. But the first orchid that we will be talking about is this one, and it is Phalaenopsis pulcherrima. Now, previously it was known as Doritis pulcherrima until Doritis orchids were grouped together with the Phalaenopsis genus. So this is now a Phalaenopsis orchid, and it is the only one of my Phalaenopsis orchids that I will probably be able to grow outdoors. We will be talking about this orchid in general and about how I have been caring for it and what my plans in the future for it will be. Okay, then the second orchid is Carolara, Kathryn the Great, and it has a very, very skinny name tag here. And I will put a timestamp for when we begin talking about this one. In general, we will give it a look, and then I will be talking about how I will care for it in my environment because it appears to be very similar to another orchid that I have, and I will be bringing that one into the video as well, just for comparison purposes. Okay, so take a little break here, and we will come back and talk about Doritis Phalaenopsis now, pulcherrima. Okay, so let's start by just talking in general terms about the species orchid Phalaenopsis pulcherrima. Now, I have a few notes over to the side because as I began to research this orchid for myself, I came across just a ton of information, and I want to be able to share some of that with you because it will relate to good growing practices, you know, as a home grower and in cultivation. Okay, so this orchid has a pretty broad range when it grows in the wild, all the way from the islands of southern China through Thailand, Vietnam, northern India, into Borneo and Malaysia. And it grows at lower altitudes on the ground in the shade of shrubs and trees. Now, it does grow in sandy, well-draining soil with organic debris. So it is technically considered a terrestrial Phalaenopsis. However, it can also grow as a lithophyte. Now, it also really enjoys warm to hot temperatures, and in the orchid world, it is referred to as a thermophilic orchid, which means it likes higher temperatures than most. It also enjoys about 80% humidity, and you can already tell that this sounds like an orchid that I could successfully grow outdoors in my climate. Now, back to the temperatures for just a little bit. In the summer, in the wild, it can tolerate temperatures up to about 88 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think translates to about 31 degrees Celsius. And in the winter, it can go as low as 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 18 degrees Celsius at night. So I should be able to keep this one outdoors until the nighttime temperatures drop below 60 degrees, and then that is the point at which I will probably need to bring it in. It also in the wild will experience about a 9 to 12 degree difference from daytime temperatures to nighttime temperatures. Now, when it's growing, it really does prefer a lot of water. But in the winter, it has a tendency to grow in areas that have a drier winter. So this orchid will probably be getting somewhat of a semi-dry winter's rest when I bring it indoors. And it blooms from summer through autumn in its native habitat, and the blooms can vary anywhere from white to pink to purplish pink, all the way to that very, very dark purple bloom color. Now, the blooms on this one don't have the arching spike like we're used to with our complex Phalaenopsis orchids. You can even see some of the remnants of the previous blooms on this plant because they are very, very stiff and tall, erect, and woody even after the fact. And you can see one there, and you can see one right here. So I don't know what color this one is. It was out of bloom when I purchased it. Let's see, what else can I tell you before we just talk about this plant in general? Well, I think that about covers it. So let's have a look more specifically at this particular plant. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about it is that it almost looks like it is growing with, it's almost like fans instead of a single monopodial growth that you might usually see on a complex Phalaenopsis. So I read about repotting these orchids, and it said when you repot it, you can divide it as long as the divisions have sufficient roots. So I will be really, really curious what will happen when I decide to repot this one. And, you know, right now it's like, I don't know what it's potted in. It's that sort of a, almost like mushy cocoa husk, very, very fine cocoa husk. And I have read that it will likely prefer a clay pot with more, I would say, inorganic media like charcoal, perlite, rock, and they suggested using sphagnum for this orchid only when you're growing in conditions that are lower humidity. So I will have to decide what to do when this one gets repotted. Also, the recommendation was to wait until you see new root growth before attempting to repot it. So, lots of things to look forward to with this brand new orchid in my collection. I have a feeling that this one is probably not white because I do see the purplish anthocyanin marks on the leaves, which indicates that the blooms will likely have some pink purple coloration in them. So very, very excited to have this orchid in my collection as a species Phalaenopsis. It, for the last 3 weeks, has been on the shady end of the OrchidHut shelf, and I have been carefully watering it, letting it go almost completely dry before watering it again. This is an orchid, because it's in a darker pot, that I have been picking it up to kind of get a feel for how much moisture is left based on the weight. I don't typically do that because most of my orchids are in clear pots, and you know, I can sort of tell by looking whether or not the media inside is wet. But I have been using the weight test on this particular one. And yeah, looking forward to this one blooming. I don't know if it will bloom this autumn or winter. I'm continually looking down in all of this growth to see if I see any indication of a new spike. I haven't done anything yet to clean this one up, so I'll do that when I repot it. And there you go, Phalaenopsis pulcherrima. All right, moving on to orchid number 2. Okay, so let's talk about the second orchid, Carolara, Kathryn the Great. Now, I have to share a little bit of a funny story about shopping for both of these orchids, actually. It was in the hottest part of summer imaginable when I went out shopping in my usual shopping places in Houston for orchids. And most of the nurseries who typically carry, you know, a minimal collection of orchids had given up on even having plants like that. And the only one that you could find outdoors to purchase was the Phalaenopsis pulcherrima, the previous orchid. And now that I think back in hindsight, it's like, yeah, that's because that orchid is the only one that can tolerate the heat, and any of the other orchids that they would have been trying to maintain probably would have just failed, you know, in a nursery environment when they don't focus on growing orchids. Well, the one place that I shop that always has a lot of orchids in stock, even if they're out of bloom and have been discounted, you know, they do have a good variety year-round. I went to that location and it was so absolutely hot that they moved their outdoor orchids in. But that actually wasn't an improvement, because moving them in meant that they went into a relatively dark little side building that they have, and there was no air conditioning in there, so it was darker and hotter than it actually was outside. So this particular orchid that you see in front of you, I think I purchased in near complete darkness and you know, in about 115 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. And so when I was looking at all of these orchids they had brought in just to try to save them from the heat, and I don't know if they were successful, because I do believe it was hotter inside that building than it was outside. But in any case, this orchid had just been shipped, so, you know, it had been sort of stressed from the shipment. It had been stressed from the heat of the outdoors. It had probably been stressed for a few days being brought inside to the darkness and even hotter temperatures. And, you know, as I was going around trying to shop from what they had that still looked healthy, you know, you could barely even read the tag. So I found Carolara orchid, and, you know, I didn't even know what is that genus. That's not even an orchid I was familiar with. But when I looked at this plant, it was so very similar to another orchid that I have in my collection. The pseudobulbs look similar, the leaves look similar, the growth pattern looks similar, and it did have a bloom spike on it when I purchased it, and the first bloom was just opening, and it had 3 more buds. And what ended up happening is that those 3 other buds didn't open properly. The lips were curled, and the last 2 were very small in size and were a little bit misshapen. I did take a picture of the one bud that opened successfully, and I'll insert that here so that you can see what the bloom looked like. And I was even looking at the bloom and I was thinking, gosh, that looks like another orchid that I have in my collection. So, of course, when I get home, I look up Carolara, and I find out that it is a cross between Agonesia, Zygo, and Zygo sepalum. Sepalum? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But basically, it's a zygo. And I have a Zygonesia in my collection by the name of Snowbird. And this is the orchid that I thought was kind of its larger twin, because it has the exact same pseudobulb look. It has the same look to the leaves. The Zygonesia is a larger plant, but maybe that's, partly because it's an older plant. But, gosh, it was very recognizable, even though I was purchasing a Carolara and I had no idea what that was. So, let's talk about the other similarities with this orchid, and hopefully I can be successful with this one reblooming for me, because the Zygonesia does really well in the fall and the winter. So right here is where the bloom spike was cut away, and the growth pattern of this orchid is to bloom first, right after the beginning of the leaves, and then later develop the pseudobulb down here. So the pseudobulb is actually the very last thing to develop on these particular zygos anyway. All right, so I thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed these orchids or learned something new, please give the video a thumbs up, hit that notifications bell so you know when I've posted something new, and please consider subscribing, because it does make all the difference for the channel. Talk to you next time.